Leonardo da Vinci, the illegitimate son of a notary who defied the odds to paint the Mona Lisa and envision flying machines centuries before the world was ready for them. There are names that become synonymous with entire eras. When we say the Renaissance, we almost always imagine a single person. Leonardo da Vinci, the artist who created the most enigmatic smiles in the history of art. The scientist whose anatomical drawings astonish with their precision to this day. The inventor who, 500 years before they existed, drew a helicopter, a tank, and a submarine. But who was this man really? How could the illegitimate son of a simple notary from a small Tuscan town become a friend of kings and the most sought-after genius of his time? It is true that he was not only a painter, but also an engineer, anatomist, musician, architect, botanist, and writer. And what secrets and unrealized projects are hidden behind his famous works? In this story, we will walk through the entire life path of Leonardo. We will discover why he left most of his paintings unfinished, how, risking being accused of heresy, he dissected corpses in secret at night to study the structure of the human body, and why many of his brilliant inventions never made it off the paper. This is not just the story of an artist. It is the story of a human curiosity without limits, of a mind that tried to encompass and understand the entire universe, from the flight of a dragonfly to the movement of the planets. Our story begins on April 15th, 1452, in the small town of Vinci, lost among the hills and olive groves of Tuscany, near Florence. Leonardo was born from an extramarital affair. His father was Piero da Vinci, a young and successful Florentine notary. His mother, a simple peasant woman named Caterina. According to the laws of the time, his illegitimate status closed many doors for him. He could not be a notary like his father, nor a doctor, nor a lawyer. He could not join the prestigious guilds. His future seemed very uncertain. However, this misfortune of birth perhaps became his greatest gift. Unable to follow a beaten path, from a young age, he was left to himself and to nature. He spent his early years not at a desk studying Latin, but in the countryside, on the farm of his grandfather. He spent entire days wandering the surrounding hills, fields, and rivers. He did not just walk. He observed everything. It fascinated him. He could spend hours following the flight of a bird, trying to understand exactly how its wings created lift. He drew in his notebook how the shape of the clouds changed before a storm. He studied how water flowed around the stones in a stream, creating whirlpools. He took apart flowers to understand the structure of their petals and stamens. He caught lizards and insects to study the anatomy of their legs and wings. Nature was his main teacher, and curiosity his main engine. Unlike other children, he saw no difference between art and science. For him, drawing was not simply a way to represent something beautiful. It was a research tool. He did not draw to show what something looked like, but to understand why it looked that way and how it worked. This approach would become the foundation of all his genius. His father, Piero, although he could not pass his profession to his son, saw in him an extraordinary talent for drawing. According to legend, when Leonardo was about 14 years old, his father gave him a wooden shield and asked him to paint it. Instead of drawing a coat of arms or a common saint, the young Leonardo, inspired by the stories of the Gorgon Medusa, decided to depict a monster. He brought lizards, snakes, bats, and crickets into his room, and by combining parts of their bodies, he created an incredibly realistic and terrifying image of a monster that seemed about to jump off the shield. Seeing this work, his father was so impressed that he sold the shield to a merchant and bought a new one for his son. But the most important thing was that he understood he did not have a talented child before him, but a future great artist. It was then that he made the decision that would change the entire life of Leonardo. He took him out of the town and brought him to Florence, the cultural capital of the world at the time, the city where the greatest minds and artists were creating. There he placed his son in the workshop of the most famous and influential painter in Florence, Andrea del Verrocchio. For an illegitimate boy from a small town, this was an incredible opportunity. He had arrived at the very epicenter of the Italian Renaissance, and his true education was just beginning. The workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence was not a simple art studio. It was an authentic universal factory of the Renaissance era. Verrocchio was not only a painter, but also a sculptor, goldsmith, and engineer. There, they created not only paintings, but also bronze statues, marble fountains, jewelry, and even complex theatrical mechanisms. For the young Leonardo, with his boundless curiosity, this was the ideal place. He had plunged into a world where art and technology were inseparably linked. The life of an apprentice was hard and monotonous. Leonardo started from the very basics. For years, he ground colors, mixing mineral pigments with oil. He prepared wooden panels for painting, covering them with layers of plaster. He learned how to make brushes. He studied the chemistry of pigments, the fundamentals of optics to understand how light struck, and anatomy to correctly represent the human body. The workshop of Verrocchio was famous for its anatomical studies, and Leonardo absorbed this knowledge eagerly. But very soon, it became clear that he was not a simple, diligent student. His talent was of a higher order. He did not just copy, he investigated. When he was tasked with drawing a cloth, he did not just draw the folds. He made dozens of sketches, studying how the fabric wrinkled, how it reflected light, how its texture affected the color. He created clay models, wrapped them in wet cloth, and drew them for hours, seeking absolute realism. It was in the workshop of Verrocchio that the legendary episode occurred, marking the birth of a new genius. Verrocchio received a commission for a large painting, The Baptism of Christ. While working on it, as was customary, he entrusted his best student, Leonardo, to paint one of the secondary figures, the angel holding the garments of Christ. When Leonardo finished his part, the difference was astounding. The figures painted by Verrocchio himself were good, but they were done in the traditional and somewhat rigid style of the time. But the angel of Leonardo was alive. Its hair was soft and silky, its gaze deep and spiritual, and the folds of its clothes looked real. Leonardo applied a new technique he had developed, sfumato, an almost imperceptible haze that softened the contours and created a sense of atmospheric perspective. According to legend, when Verrocchio saw the angel painted by his student, he was so impressed by that supernatural mastery that, in anger, he broke his brushes and swore never to touch paint again, recognizing that the pupil had surpassed the master. At the age of 20, Leonardo was admitted to the Guild of St. Luke, the guild of artists in Florence, which gave him the right to work as an independent master. He opened his own workshop. The commissions did not take long to arrive. Monasteries, churches, wealthy citizens, everyone wanted a painting from the young and incredibly talented artist. But this is where the main tragedy of the genius of Leonardo manifested itself for the first time. He was a perfectionist to the core, but his interests were far too broad. He could start working on a painting, but in the process, get carried away by the study of optics to understand how light fell, or start studying botany to represent the plants in the background with maximum precision, or dive headfirst into anatomy to understand which muscle was responsible for a certain emotion on the face of a character. Painting, for him, was not an end, but a byproduct of his endless investigations. As a result, most of his early Florentine works were left unfinished. The famous Adoration of the Magi, a brilliant work in its composition and concept, was simply abandoned at the sketch stage because his mind was already captivated by new and more interesting tasks. This lack of commitment to commissions gave him a reputation as a talented but unreliable man. But Leonardo himself seemed to care little about this. His true passion lay not in finishing the works, but in the very process of knowledge. His famous notebooks, which he kept all his life, already in that period, began to fill with thousands of drawings, sketches, and notes. He wrote from right to left, in mirror writing, either to keep his ideas secret or simply because, being left-handed, it was more comfortable for him. He drew everything: the whirlpools of water, the profiles of passers-by with interesting faces, the structure of the wing of a bat, the blueprints of cranes and war machines. His brain was like a tireless machine, absorbing, analyzing, and systematizing all the information about the world around him. He was not just an artist. He was the first true scientist in the modern sense of the word. However, Florence, a city of bankers and merchants, was too small for him. Here, the result was valued: the finished painting, the statue, But Leonardo valued the process, the investigation, and when he heard that in Milan, at the court of Duke Ludovico Sforza, they needed military engineers, architects, and organizers of lavish parties, more than painters, he understood that it was his chance. The chance to realize all his talents, not just the pictorial one. In 1482, at the age of 30, Leonardo da Vinci left Florence and headed to Milan toward a new chapter of his life that would bring him worldwide fame. Upon arriving in Milan, Leonardo presented himself to Duke Ludovico Sforza, not as an artist, but, above all, as a military engineer. In his famous cover letter, a kind of resume, he detailed in 9 points his skills in the art of war. He claimed he could build light and portable bridges, create new types of siege machines, catapults and mortars, design impregnable fortresses, and even armored cars, which today we would call tanks. And only in the last point, the 10th, he modestly added that, in times of peace, in painting, I can compete with any other, whoever he may be. Ludovico Sforza, the ruler of Milan, was an ambitious and warlike man. His court was one of the most brilliant in Europe, but he constantly needed military engineers to strengthen his positions. He hired Leonardo, and thus began the longest and perhaps the most productive period in the life of the master, which lasted almost 17 years. Paradoxically, most of the grandiose military projects of Leonardo never made it off the paper. His designs were centuries ahead of his time. He projected multi-barrel weapons, machine gun prototypes, submarines, and diving suits. But the technology of the time simply did not allow these bold ideas to be realized. However, his talents found application in more peaceful fields. He worked as an architect, participating in the design of the dome of the Milan Cathedral. He dedicated himself to hydraulics, developing complex systems of canals and locks to make the rivers of Lombardy navigable. He was an unsurpassed organizer of court parties. For weddings, receptions, and carnivals, he created incredible mechanical scenographies, living pictures, costumes, and automatons. For one of the parties, he built a mechanical lion that could walk and that, stopping in front of the king, opened its chest, from which lilies fell. These toys were not simple entertainment. They were a demonstration of the power and wealth of the Milanese court. But, of course, it was in Milan where Leonardo created 2 of his greatest masterpieces. The first was the equestrian statue of Francesco Sforza, the father of Ludovico. Leonardo approached this task with scientific rigor. He spent years studying the anatomy of horses. He made hundreds of sketches, modeled in wax, and developed a unique technique to cast the gigantic bronze statue of almost 23 feet all at once. The life-size clay model of the horse he finally created astonished his contemporaries with its realism and dynamism. It was ready to be cast in bronze, but French troops invaded Milan, and all the bronze prepared for the monument was melted down to make cannons. The clay model itself was barbarically used by the French soldiers as a target for archery practice and was completely destroyed. The largest equestrian monument of the time was never realized, but the second masterpiece he created in Milan has survived to this day, although in a semi-destroyed state. It was the fresco of the Last Supper in the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie. Here too, Leonardo went against all traditions. Instead of the classic fresco technique, painting on wet plaster, which required fast work, he decided to experiment. He used oil paints and tempera, applying them to the dry wall as if it were a canvas. This allowed him to work slowly, make corrections, and achieve incredible psychological depth and detail. He depicted not the moment of communion, but the most dramatic moment of the dinner when Jesus utters the words, "One of you will betray me." The entire composition is built around this phrase. We see how a wave of emotions, shock, perplexity, anger, fear, spreads from the figure of Christ, who sits in the center, in a posture of absolute calm and acceptance of his fate. Each of the 12 apostles reacts in his own way, according to his character. Leonardo, like a brilliant psychologist, conveys their inner state through gestures, postures, and looks. This fresco became the pinnacle of psychological realism in painting. Unfortunately, his technical experiment failed. The paint began to flake even during the lifetime of the artist. and the Last Supper has come down to us as a shadow of its former splendor. It was in Milan that Leonardo dove headfirst into his most secret and dangerous investigations: anatomy. To understand how to draw the human being, it was not enough for him to look at it. He wanted to know how it was made on the inside. At night, in secret, risking being accused of witchcraft and excommunicated by the church, he dissected corpses in the hospital morgues. Throughout his life, he dissected more than 30 bodies, men, women, and the elderly. The result of these investigations were hundreds of incredibly precise and beautiful anatomical drawings. He was the first in history to draw in detail the structure of the human heart, its valves, and blood vessels. He studied the functioning of muscles and bones, creating drawings that are still used in medical atlases today. He investigated the development of the embryo in the womb of the mother. It was pure science, driven by an insatiable curiosity. He wanted to understand what life was, how it began, how it worked, and how it faded. These investigations were the peak of his genius, the point where art and science merged. But in 1499, the peaceful life in Milan came to an end. French troops invaded Italy again. Duke Sforza fled, and Leonardo, having lost his patron, was forced to hit the road once more. The fall of Milan in 1499 marked for Leonardo, who was already almost 50 years old, the beginning of a new and turbulent period. The era of stability and the generous patronage of Duke Sforza was over. He would spend the following years in a constant pilgrimage through the cities of Italy, offering his services to different rulers, looking for a new place where his genius could find application. First, he headed to Mantua, to the court of Isabella of Este, an enlightened woman passionate about art. There he created the famous pencil portrait of the Marchioness, which amazed everyone with its liveliness and likeness. Isabella begged him to paint an oil portrait from the drawing, but Leonardo, true to his nature, postponed the work, promised it, but never carried it out, leaving not only this magnificent cartoon. Then he traveled to Venice, the Republic city, threatened by an invasion from the Ottoman Empire. It was more interested in his talents as a military engineer than as a painter. Leonardo proposed to the Senate of Venice grandiose projects for the defense of the city. He designed plans to create mobile underwater barriers to block the enemy fleet. He proposed designs for diving suits for sabotage attacks on ship hulls, but his ideas seemed too bold, too futuristic, and, above all, too expensive. The Venetians politely thanked him, but none of his projects ever materialized. Finally, in 1500, after almost 20 years of absence, Leonardo returned to Florence. The city received him as a living legend. His fame, especially after the creation of the Last Supper, echoed throughout Italy. The monks of the Santissima Annunziata convent commissioned him an altarpiece of Saint Anne, the Virgin, and the Child. Leonardo created the cartoon, a full-size preparatory drawing. When this cartoon was exhibited to the public, all of Florence, young and old, as a contemporary wrote, flocked for 2 days to see that marvel. People were impressed by the complexity of the composition, the tenderness, and the liveliness of the faces. But, as often happened with Leonardo, the work did not go beyond the cartoon. He never transferred the design to a panel, leaving us only this preparatory masterpiece. In this same period, the most unexpected and perhaps the darkest event of his career took place. In 1502, he entered the service of the man who was his complete opposite. His new patron was Cesare Borgia. Son of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare was the most ruthless, cynical, and effective general of his time. He was forging his own state in the center of Italy with an iron fist, without hesitation in murder, betrayal, or treachery. What could a humanist genius like Leonardo be doing in the service of such a demon? He served him as chief military engineer and cartographer. Leonardo traveled all the lands conquered by Borgia, creating maps of incredible precision for the time. They were not simple schemes. Using instruments designed by himself, he created aerial view maps in which cities, rivers, roads, and the relief of the terrain were represented with photographic precision. These maps were a very powerful military tool, which allowed planning the movement of troops and logistics. He also designed new types of weaponry and fortifications for Borgia. This alliance of genius and evil was brief. As soon as his father, the Pope, died, the power of Cesare Borgia collapsed, and Leonardo was left without a patron again. He returned once more to Florence, and it was in this second Florentine period when, apparently, he began to work on his most famous, most enigmatic, and most debated work. He received a commission from a wealthy Florentine silk merchant, Francesco del Giocondo, to paint the portrait of his wife, Lisa Gherardini. This portrait would go down in history as the Mona Lisa, or La Gioconda. Leonardo worked on it for several years, which was completely atypical for him. He did not abandon it. He carried it with him everywhere, retouching it, correcting it, and constantly perfecting it. What was so special about this portrait? First, it was a revolution in the portrait genre. Before Leonardo, people were represented in a strict profile or in a static frontal pose. Leonardo turned his model in 3/4, creating a sense of movement and naturalness. Second, he placed her not against a dark, conventional background, but before a mysterious, almost fantastic landscape with rivers and rocks that seemed to have a life of their own. But the main secret, of course, was in her face, in her famous and barely perceptible smile. Leonardo, using his genius sfumato technique, created the effect of an elusive emotion. When we look directly at her lips, the smile disappears. When we look at her eyes, it seems to us that the corners of her lips rise again. The expression on her face changes constantly. She is alive. She is not posing. She is thinking. She is feeling. Leonardo did not simply paint the portrait of a woman. He painted the portrait of the human soul, with all its complexity, mystery, and depth. According to one version, to maintain that lively and melancholic expression on the face of Mona Lisa, during the sessions, he invited musicians and jesters to entertain her. He never delivered the portrait to the man who commissioned it. He kept it for himself, considering it unfinished, imperfect. This small poplar panel became his eternal companion, his creative testament, which he would continue to retouch almost until the day of his death. In Florence, Leonardo was a recognized genius, but the city was too narrow for his ambitions, and, more importantly, it was too oriented towards pure art. At the same time, the center of Italian cultural and political life was shifting to Rome. The new Pope, Leo X, of the powerful Medici family, had initiated a grandiose remodeling of the Vatican, inviting the best artists, architects, and scientists from all over Italy to his court. For Leonardo, who was already over 60 years old, this seemed to be the last chance to realize his boldest engineering and scientific projects. In 1513, he accepted the invitation and moved to the Eternal City. He was provided with apartments and a workshop in the very Belvedere Palace of the Vatican. He was surrounded by honors. The Pope showed him his favor. It seemed that, at last, the long-awaited triumph had arrived. But reality turned out to be different. Rome was nothing like Florence or Milan. Here, fierce court intrigues boiled over. Every artist, every architect had their protectors and their enemies. And the undisputed favorite of Pope Leo X, his absolute star, was a young, impetuous, and incredibly talented genius. Michelangelo Buonarroti. The rivalry between Leonardo and Michelangelo had begun in Florence, but in Rome it reached its peak. It was not a simple competition between two artists. It was the clash of two worlds, of two temperaments, of two philosophies. Michelangelo was a sculptor in his soul. Even when he painted, his art was power, drama, tension, the physical strength of the human body. He was a passionate, sullen man of sharp judgments and completely absorbed in his art. Leonardo, on the other hand, was a scientist, a researcher. His art was harmony, mystery, psychology, the subtlest movements of the soul. He was a man of the world, charming and elegant, whose interests extended far beyond painting. Michelangelo despised Leonardo, considering him an unreliable dilettante who started hundreds of things and finished none. He openly mocked him, reminding him of the failure of the Sforza equestrian statue, which he never managed to cast in bronze. Leonardo, for his part, considered the art of Michelangelo too muscular, coarse, lacking in intellectual depth. He said his figures looked like sacks of walnuts. This rivalry did not favor Leonardo. The Pope and the cardinals gave Michelangelo grandiose and epic commissions. The painting of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the tomb of Pope Julius II, while Leonardo only received minor and insignificant commissions. They asked him to develop a new method for minting coins or projects to drain swamps. His genius as an engineer and scientist was valued, but his talent as a painter remained untapped. An anecdote has been preserved that vividly illustrates his situation. The Pope commissioned Leonardo a small painting. Upon hearing this, the artist immediately locked himself in his workshop and, instead of painting, began to conduct chemical experiments. He set out to develop a new and special varnish that was meant to make the colors eternal. When the Pope learned that Leonardo had begun working on the painting by manufacturing the varnish, he exclaimed bitterly, "Alas, this man will never finish anything, for he thinks of the end before the beginning." The years in Rome became a time of disappointment for Leonardo. He drifted further and further away from painting and immersed himself almost completely in his scientific research. He continued with his anatomical dissections, but now in secret, fearing being reported. He spent hours in his workshop, filling his notebooks with designs for mirrors, to concentrate solar energy, blueprints for flying machines, studies of hydraulics and geology. He studied the structure of the wing of a bird, trying to unravel the secret of flight. He investigated the fossils of seashells found in the mountains and came to the brilliant conclusion that those mountains had once been the bottom of the sea, refuting the biblical theory of the universal flood. He was absorbed in science, but he was alone. His great ideas found no support. He was considered an eccentric, a dreamer, almost a sorcerer. He watched as young, energetic artists like Raphael copied his own techniques, his sfumato, his compositional solutions, and achieved incredible success, securing the commissions he could only dream of. Rome, the city that should have been the peak of his career, became the place where he felt his loneliness and misunderstanding most acutely. His time was passing. The time of other geniuses was arriving, with a different energy and a different art. And when in 1516 an invitation arrived from France, from the young and ambitious King Francis I, who since his youth was a passionate admirer of Italian art, and of Leonardo in particular, the old master accepted without hesitation. He gathered his manuscripts, some of his favorite paintings, including the Mona Lisa that he never delivered, and left Italy forever, to spend the last years of his life, where he was valued not for what he could do, but for who he was. The crossing of the Alps in the fall of 1516 was a symbolic act for Leonardo, who was already 64 years old. He was leaving Italy forever, the country that had given him life and fame, but that had never quite managed to fully understand and accept his genius. He was heading to France, to the court of the young King Francis I. It was not a flight or a search for work, it was an invitation to an honorable retirement. Francis I was a passionate admirer of the Italian Renaissance. He saw in Leonardo not just a painter or an engineer, but the living embodiment of genius, a demigod of art and science. He did not expect him to fulfill specific commissions. He simply wanted to have this great man by his side, to learn from him, to talk with him, to brush against his wisdom. Leonardo was received with unprecedented honors. The king granted him the title of first painter, engineer, and architect of the king, and assigned him a huge annual pension. But the most important thing was that he gifted him the small but cozy Château du Clos-Luch, located very close to the royal residence in Amboise. According to legend, there was even a secret underground passageway between the two castles, through which the young king could visit the old master at any time without drawing attention. For the first time in many years, Leonardo found what he had never had: total financial independence, absolute creative freedom, and, above all, peace. He was no longer required to finish paintings urgently or to build war machines. His only obligation was to be Leonardo da Vinci. The last 3 years of his life in the Château du Clos-Luch were filled with a quiet and contemplative activity. He barely painted new pictures. His right hand had been paralyzed after a stroke, and although being left-handed, he could still draw and write. His strength was no longer the same. Instead, he dedicated himself to the main task of his life, putting his colossal scientific and artistic archive in order, alongside his faithful disciple, Francesco Melzi, who had followed him from Italy, spending hours in his workshop, reviewing the thousands of pages of his notebooks. He tried to group his scattered notes by topics: anatomy, hydraulics, optics, botany, architecture, painting. He dreamed of publishing, from these notes, a great encyclopedia of human knowledge. He dictated explanations to Melzi, made new sketches, polished old ideas. It was a titanic work, almost unrealizable, which he never managed to complete. King Francis I treated him with a filial respect. Often, without prior notice, he would visit Clos Luce and spend hours talking with Leonardo. They discussed everything: philosophy, astronomy, new architectural projects. Leonardo, at the request of the king, designed the plans for the new royal palace of Chambord and proposed plans to divert the courses of the rivers to connect the Loire and the Saône. For Francis, he was not a court painter, but a father, as the king himself called him. A famous anecdote told by the sculptor Benvenuto Cellini has been preserved, in which Francis I said that he did not believe another man had been born in the world who knew as much as Leonardo. In these last years, Leonardo continued to carry his three favorite paintings with him everywhere, never fully finished: Saint Anne, Saint John the Baptist, and, of course, the Mona Lisa. He returned to them, constantly applying extremely thin layers of almost invisible paint, changing something, deepening the shadows, making the smile of La Gioconda even more enigmatic. These paintings were his eternal interlocutors, his creative diary. The health of the old master gradually deteriorated. He left his castle less and less, but his mind remained lucid and sharp until the end. He drafted a detailed will, disposing of his assets, his paintings, and, above all, his invaluable manuscripts, which he bequeathed to his faithful disciple Melzi. Leonardo da Vinci died on May 2nd, 1519, at the age of 67, in his Château du Clos Luce. According to a beautiful, although probably fictional legend, he died in the arms of King Francis I himself, who had come to visit his friend. He was buried in the small church of a monastery in Amboise, but during the wars of religion, his tomb, like many others, was desecrated and his remains were lost. The man who had strived so much to know the structure of the world did not even have a tomb of his own. But that no longer mattered. His true and imperishable legacy, his thoughts, his art, his insatiable curiosity, was just beginning its long journey to immortality. When Leonardo da Vinci passed away, the world seemed not to immediately understand the magnitude of the loss. He died far from his homeland. His main works were unfinished, hidden from the public eye, or, like the Last Supper, were already beginning to deteriorate. And his greatest treasure, thousands of pages of manuscripts with scientific discoveries and brilliant intuitions, remained in the hands of his disciple, and for long centuries was practically lost to the world. It seemed that history would remember him simply as one of the great artists of his time, although the most enigmatic one. But the true legacy of Leonardo turned out to be like a seed that, after lying underground for hundreds of years, suddenly sprouted with incredible strength. His influence on painting was immediate and total. Young artists like Raphael copied his compositions, his sfumato technique, his ability to convey the psychology of the characters. He alone practically changed the rules of the game. After him, art could no longer simply be beautiful. It had to be intelligent, deep, full of meaning and mystery. The Mona Lisa, upon passing into the collection of the kings of France and then to the Louvre, transformed from a simple portrait into the main cultural myth of Western civilization, into an eternal enigma that each new generation tries to decipher in its own way. But his legacy as a scientist turned out to be much more complex and tragic. His anatomical drawings, 200 or 300 years ahead of his time, were never published. If the world had seen them in the 16th century, the entire history of medicine might have followed a different path. His geological observations that the mountains had once been the bottom of the sea were rediscovered by science only in the 18th century. His designs for flying machines, submarines, parachutes, cars, robotic knights, all of it seemed to his contemporaries like mere extravagant fantasies. And only centuries later, when science and technology finally caught up to his intuitions, humanity understood with astonishment that this 15th century artist had already drawn our world. He was not a simple inventor. He was a prophet of the technological age. But perhaps, His main legacy is not specific paintings or designs. It is the method itself, the approach to knowing the world. Leonardo was the first person who so consistently and passionately united the two great forces of the human mind, art and science. Before him, the artist represented, the scientist described, the philosopher reflected. Leonardo did it all at the same time. He saw no difference between the beauty of a flower and the precision of its botanical structure. For him, the flight of a bird was at once a miracle worthy of the brush of an artist and a complex engineering problem that had to be solved. He taught us the most important thing. To truly understand something, first you have to learn to see carefully, thoroughly, without prejudice. His endless sketches were not just art. They were his way of thinking, his way of asking questions to nature and receiving its answers. And today, when we admire his paintings, in reality, we do not just admire beauty, we admire the power of the human mind, its limitless capacity for knowledge, its insatiable curiosity. Leonardo da Vinci did not just leave us works of art, he left us the most important testament. Never stop asking why, and in this simple question lies the secret not only of scientific progress, but also of the eternal youth of the soul. His body decomposed a long time ago, but his mind, his curiosity, his genius are still alive. In every painting, in every design, in every flight of an airplane, in every beat of the human heart, whose mystery he tried so hard to unravel.